Trauma transgeneracyjna. Kit czy coś, co faktycznie waży na naszym funkcjonowaniu? Nie znam się na biologicznych mechanizmach na tyle, aby być tutaj głosem eksperckim, zatem zamiast głosić magiczne treści, zapraszam do rozmowy wybitnego specjalistę w tej dziedzinie, lekarza i naukowca, autora publikacji w takich czasopismach jak Nature czy Science. Niech to już mówi samo za siebie. Przed wami dr Ali Jawaid. Ja nazywam się Joanna Gutral, jestem psycholożką i psychoterapeutką, a to jest mój podcast psychoedukacyjny, który nie powstałby bez wsparcia patronów i patronek. Podcast, uprzedzę, realizowany jest w języku angielskim, ale tłumaczenie rozmowy znajdziecie na moim blogu www.joannagutral.pl. Bierzcie i ślijcie w świat, bo wierzę, że rozumienie jest ważne w życiu, a nawet bardzo ważne. Zapraszam do wysłuchania rozmowy. Hi, hello. Good to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thanks for a very gracious invitation. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so let's start with the big question that later will let us determine if we want to continue this conversation or not. Transgenerational trauma. Does it exist?
It does. It does. Perhaps it exists in a form which has not been studied in the most accurate manner. I would also say that now we are studying it in a form where we actually know the mechanisms involved, at least some of the mechanisms. Also, what we can do to potentially reduce this transmission. But again, transgenerational trauma, I would talk about, and what we would discuss in this podcast may be a little different from the concept a lot of people have in the community.
I'm glad you said that because, transgenerational trauma is doing a big career in social media, in pop psychology, which is claiming that is the real psychology or real biology. And I believe that big portion of that information is far away from what epigenetic is. And I don't blame people for not understanding. This is a pretty complex, difficult subject. People are spending their lifetime careers on trying to solve the very complex problems. But how traumatic stress is actually influencing our body and our brains?
So I think, so first I completely agree with you that transgenerational trauma, I think in itself is not a very well-defined term. When we say transgenerational trauma, then what we actually imply is that we are inheriting the traumas from our parents, our ancestors, and it is running through generations. Some people believe that it is, our past lives. Some people have like varying different concepts about it. But I think what is really important to understand is that it is not transgenerational trauma. It is actually the transmission of the effects of trauma, right? So how trauma is affecting a parent could be transmitted down to their offspring. So this transmission could be, broadly speaking, in two ways. One is that people who, for example, underwent a lot of trauma or adversity during their childhood, when they become parents themselves, then they have unhealthy and they have parenting styles which are not very nurturing. So because they are not, let's say to put it simply, very, very healthy parents themselves, their children could develop some behaviors, and through this psychosocial transmission, some effects of their own traumas are transmitted to the next generation. That is one path. But the other path, which we say is more biological, is actually dependent on our germline cells. And a lot of times when I use the term germline, people think that it's about bacteria and germs, but it's not. Actually, we have two different types of cells in our body. So we have somatic cells, which form all different organs, from our heart to our brain to kidneys. They're formed from somatic cells. But then we also have these germ cells, sperm in males, biologically speaking, and oocytes in females. And in the end, we are formed from the fertilization of the sperm and egg. So these are pluripotent, which means that they can form all different organs in the body. So germ cells also give rise, in essence, to somatic cells. So because this is how an organism is formed, we have to think about what is transmitted from the parent to the offspring, which will be formed from these germ cells. So the main biological pathway of this transgenerational transmission of the effects of trauma is through changes in the sperm and egg. And this is actually something which has been studied, I would say, a lot rigorously in the last 10 to 15 years. And this is also the topic of my own research.
All right. So I understand that during that process, there is a lot of things that can go wrong. Mm-hmm. Okay. This is biology. It sounds simple when it's in a perfect model, but in reality, there is a tons of things that can go wrong. And on the top of that, we can put a traumatic situation. When I say traumatic situation, I also refer to the original definition of trauma, because that's another word that kind of got overused and I think lost the meaning. Traumatic event is when your life or life of your close ones is endangered and your life is threatened, your health, your safety. So I believe that it increases the potential of things going off rails. Am I correct?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And I think, again, I would, I picked two keywords here. One, you said, not everything is trauma. And I completely agree. If someone, let's say, is giving you a feedback about your performance and work, and, you don't agree on something, this is not trauma. Trauma is something when really, your life, your survival, your integrity is endangered. So it is something quite severe. A simple example would be people living through wars, genocides, where they're constantly fighting for their survival. I think that is actually real trauma. Or if we look at all these different scales through which we assess stress severity, traumatic sexual abuse, traumatic physical abuse, death of parents. These are significant traumatic events, which we now know are also impacting the epigenome in the germline. So as you mentioned, when a new organism is formed from a sperm and an egg, a lot of things can go wrong during the process. So trauma definitely can impact either the germ cells directly or it can impact them indirectly. So if we think about how the germ cells are developed in males versus females, so in males we are formed we are born with these certain number of spermatogonial stem cells. To put them simply, these are stem cells which will form sperm in the end. And then after the release of testosterone during adolescence, males, they start producing these sperms de novo, meaning that from the stem cells, they form a mature sperm every few months, right? Now, if anything is going wrong, during childhood, let's say something severely traumatic, it can impact either those stem cells, or if something very traumatic is happening during adulthood or adolescence, it can affect the maturation of the sperm. So then the sperm will be carrying these marks, and when it will fertilize an egg, it will carry it on to the next generation. So this is one path. For oocytes, it's a little bit different. So oocytes are eggs, and females are born with a certain number of eggs, and they're not forming a new egg similar to how males do, which means that in case of females, trauma can actually accumulate. So anything which a female is experiencing very traumatic from childhood onwards until she becomes a mother herself, it is leaving its impact potentially on those oocytes. So trauma can actually accumulate. So I would say this is how the germ cells are affected, and through the germ cells, then the next child, the next offspring would be affected.
And what are the visible effects? Are there any visible effects that one day, I was born and raised in Poland, and my grandparents, who are luckily still with us, they remember Second World War. They remember the very traumatic experience during that time and when they were kids, and after that, losing their parents. I'm wondering if there's anything wrong with me, and some, transgenerational trauma is passed through me, but I'm not aware of that. Can it be activated at some point?
Well, I'd say I see nothing wrong with you so far, but
so far.
but definitely talking about the evidence, for this transgenerational trauma, or to put it more accurately, the effects of trauma, in the ancestors. I think the major evidence comes from the studies on Holocaust. So there's pioneering work from Rachel Yehuda. She's based in New York, leading a very large research group, and they studied the Holocaust survivors, their children, and their grandchildren. And what they found out was that there is increased stress reactivity in the children as well as grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. Now, a lot of Holocaust survivors, they have passed away now, so it was not possible to study the impact on their germ cells. But what they did was that they looked for some specific epigenetic marks. So by epigenetics, I mean not DNA mutations, but there are certain ways through the expression of DNA could be altered. And this is what we call epigenetics. So they found out that there are some epigenetic changes in the genes regulating stress, and they are present also in the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. So this was the first evidence. But these studies, what they lacked was a cause and effect relationship, right? Because for cause and effect relationship, we need to show that trauma leads to changes in the germ cells, and these germ cells then transmit it to the next generation or potentially several generations. So that evidence actually so far has only come in mammals from studies on mice and rats.
Okay, that's pretty important. So how did we get to the point that, I'm going to go back to the social media because scientists, I like scientists, I consider myself being one, but we are not often using human language. And somehow transgeneratic trauma got to the public appearance, and there is a lot of miscommunication about that. You said that we have research on mice and rats. I do appreciate them, but still, they are not humans. So how did it happen that we have so false understanding of transgenerational trauma in the public speaking?
Yeah. So maybe I will go back into science and talk about how accurately we can study transgenerational trauma in humans. And then we can go into all the myths and how to bust those myths.
Perfect.
So in mice, like I mentioned, we can have studies in which we can simulate human conditions. And then we can look at the effects temporally, right? Now, if someone wanted to study transgenerational trauma passed on through sperm and egg in humans, it was very challenging because we need several generations, right? So we would need a study which is hundreds and hundreds of years, right, to study multiple generations. Then we would also need to have access to sperm and egg, and these are very intractable, right? In case of males, there is a possibility to get seminal fluid, but in case of females for oocyte, you need to do a surgical procedure, right? So you cannot find volunteers who can be part of the study. So that's why we relied on some of these animal models. And what we try to do is to have an animal model which is very similar to human conditions. So my own research and also several other groups, they induce childhood adversity or early life stress, or what we can simply call early life trauma, in mice through following this protocol of maternal separation and maternal stress. So in this protocol, newly born pups, they are separated in an unpredictable fashion from their mothers during the first few weeks of life. During the same time, the mother is exposed to something very stressful. So this is like a dual hit model. And the combined effect of that is that the mother becomes very unnurturing, So this is very similar to childhood neglect in humans, So these neglected mice, when they grow to be adults, they show changes in their behavior. For example, they are taking more risks, so they become a little bit like borderline personality. We also see that they are cognitively impaired. We see that they are showing pro-depressive behavior, so they are showing a lot of despair, and also they show deficits in their social functioning. They stay isolated, they do not communicate with other mice that much. Plus, they're showing changes in their immune function and metabolism. But most importantly, when this trauma-affected mouse would be mated with a mouse which is not affected by trauma, we see that similar symptoms are passed on to the next generation and actually down to 4 generations. This is something which we have studied and which we have published very rigorously. Now, whatever we learn from this mouse model, we take them back and see if there are comparable signatures in human trauma cohorts. So, for example, in our research, we are working on 3 different trauma cohorts. One is a cohort of children in Pakistan where, the children lost their fathers. The mothers, they are alive, but because they're financially not viable, they were forced to give up their children for adoption to the SOS Children's Village, which is an orphanage. So the children, they are between the age of 7 to 12. So they are emotionally mature to know that the mother is alive, but they are separated from their mother. So they miss their mothers, and this is something quite traumatic from them, Now, when we study, the epigenetic marks in the blood of these children, we find signatures very similar to the mice, which means that at least some effects of trauma are conserved across species. Similarly, we have another cohort in Poland, in Wrocław, actually. And in this cohort, we have mothers who during their childhood were exposed to different levels of stresses, including childhood abuse and neglect. And then they have children themselves, and they are exclusively, these children were exclusively breastfed. So during the first few months of life, they were only receiving the milk from the mothers. And then we assess the behavior of the mothers as well as the children, epigenetic marks in the mothers as well as the children, as well as epigenetic marks in their milk. And astonishingly, we found out that in mothers who had high levels of trauma during childhood, they are passing on certain epigenetic marks in their milk. And then we already see, even at the first year of life, that there is altered behavior in the children. So this is another means of how trauma could be transmitted. And finally, we have assembled a cohort, I think, which in the field would be very vital, because this is the first time we have assessment of 2 generations as well as the germline samples, which could be a means of transfer. So this is a cohort in Bosnia. Actually, I was in Bosnia just a couple of days ago, to complete the study and to ship all the samples to Warsaw. So this cohort comprises survivors of the Srebrenica genocide. So Srebrenica genocide was one of the most unfortunate events in human history, where 8,000 individuals, mostly men, they were killed in front of their children. These children, actually, the trauma didn't stop over there, because most of their mothers were actually also, sexually assaulted, abused, or sent to brothels. So they had a very traumatic childhood. A lot of these children are themselves parents now. So they have their own children. And what we have started is, what we have collected is the blood from, the parents as well as their children, complete psychological history from parents and children, as well as the sperm from fathers, to see how much of the trauma is transmitted psychosocially and how much of the trauma is transmitted through this germline-based mechanism. And I think this study would be very conclusive in establishing that this germline-based trauma transmission can also occur in humans.
Well, it also shows that it's not that easy to study transgenerational trauma, because you're not allowed to traumatize people on purpose. So you need to find natural samples that were unfortunately exposed to some difficult events, but think for that we can do a research like that. You can do the research like that. But I also want to, you mentioned the epigenetic, like the biological side, but also psychosocial ones. So I would like to stay in the psychosocial for a second, because when your parent is not doing well, or even if it is, everyone is having their own cognitive specific, how they perceive the world, how they communicate with others, what they think about the world and the future and other people, what they can do, are they friendly or not. And it must influence our behavior, the way we see the world, the way we interact with others. Does it also influence our biology from that way?
It definitely can. So you have to think of this way that, because of unhealthy parenting styles, if someone ends up getting addicted to drugs, right now, these drugs would also affect our biology, including our germ cells. So this is how, trauma from one parent to the next generation could be indirect, but in the next generation, it could start directly affecting, these biological pathways. This is one way it can affect. And secondly, not even addictions, even simply thinking about how enriching our environment is, can have a huge influence on how trauma and other adverse exposure transmitted from one generation to another. I would also like to highlight that a lot of times when I talk about transgenerational trauma and its scientific basis, people get really very sometimes agitated, and also a lot of times very depressed, because they are so this is not my fault, and it means that now we are doomed and our generations are doomed. It is not like that, because just how trauma could be transmitted from one generation to another, also healing of trauma could be transmitted from one generation to another. So I was actually part of the group which performed the study on the effects of environmental enrichment Again, it's a mouse study, but what we did was that after traumatizing the mice, we gave them a very enriching environment before conception, so before they produce their own children. So by enriching environment, we mean a mix of cognitive stimulation, physical stimulation, and social stimulation. And what we saw was that in the mice who, after trauma, got this enriching environment, the phenotype, so the transfer of symptoms to the next generation, was very much reduced. Not fully, but it was at least partially reversed. So it means that this healing of trauma is also getting transmitted to the next generation.
What the factors are enriching the environment? So, the healing process and the benefits of growth are transmitted.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, the evidence is the strongest for, this environmental enrichment. In mice, we do it through changes in their environmental conditions. So usually, mice, they are placed in a cage where they are given food. They're given a nest sort of thing on which they can freely move around. But it is not a stimulating environment. So what we instead do is that we provide them, these little playgrounds in their cage where they have a running wheel to do the exercise, where they're put together in nice community structure. So it's not a single mouse, but a little community of mice. They can play these games together. And actually, they have a lot of things to learn. And every time they learn something, they are given a reward. So when they are in this environment, we actually see that the effects of trauma, to the next generation are much reduced. Now, if we apply that to humans, what effectively it means is, someone who was, let's say, who underwent war or genocide or something very traumatic, but is then given an environment where they have access to good education, where they are given a community structure, like foster mothers, all these kind of different modalities through which their social environment could be improved. And finally, ability to do exercise by choice, voluntary. And I think just these simple factors actually reverse some of the marks on the germ cells and can definitely improve in the long-term consequences as well as transgenerational
I'm very
transmission of
happy
trauma.
you said about that because, a lot of people say I'm lost, I'm done. My parents made so many mistakes and it's because their parents made so many mistakes. So there is no hope for me. And actually knowing that those things are reversible on multiple levels, because you said the, social interaction, the environment can influence our biology. I find it extremely important. But you gave a solution. Sounds simple. I know this is a mice model, but we hope for some further study. But we have a lot of healing programs, and I don't even know how to call them because I wouldn't like to use the word therapies. These are some sort of business courses, workshops that are offering different ways of healing transgenerational trauma. Are you aware of any actually evidence-based therapy or method that can be applied for somebody who diagnosed himself with such a condition? Yeah,
so I think what's very important is not to trivialize transgenerational trauma. So I see two different kind of behaviors. One, you're as you pointed out, a lot of people say that, they are done and they're doomed because their parents made a lot of mistakes and now they have this transgenerational trauma, which they will keep on carrying. So this is definitely not true because by, as I mentioned, enriching your own environment, there is a high likelihood that you can reduce these effects. Secondly, I think what's very important to see is that, trauma itself is not a disease. Trauma is a risk factor for diseases, right? So even if someone inherited, the effects of trauma or certain susceptibilities from their parents, just by appropriate care, they can take care of those illnesses. So for example, if we extrapolate what we have found out in our mouse studies as well as these human cohorts, it means that someone whose parents underwent a lot of traumas is likely to be, to have some sort of atypical behaviors like increased risk-taking. Right. At the same time, we can see that they are more susceptible to depression. We can see that they might have changes in their metabolism. So, they're more prone to being obese or having problems with their lipids. Now, if you think about all these susceptibilities, they can be improved by, taking therapy, having a good lifestyle, right? So even if someone has inherited traumas, just like how one has to take care of their health, maybe what we can say is that these people have to be more vigilant about taking care of their physical and psychological health. So trauma is itself not a disease which will keep on running. It can give someone susceptibilities, but those susceptibilities can be improved with a good lifestyle and with good support, which can come from a therapist as well. Now, in terms of organized programs, I can mention a study which we are doing ourselves. I would not say that you start following it right now until the results are there, but we found a role for like lipids, basically fats in your body. We found out that they are able to preserve and propagate our trauma. So they are mediators of this trauma, from one generation to another, because the question was how trauma, which is an emotional and a cognitive experience, how does it affect the germ cells, right? So then we had to think about what is carrying these effects of trauma from the brain to the germ cells, and the connection is the blood. And within the blood, we found altered lipids, So based on that, what I can at this point say is that we have started the study where, again, in these genocide survivors in Bosnia, we already have their sperm samples where we see that trauma is affecting, the quality of the sperm and some epigenetic marks in the sperm. And now we are giving them a supplementation of omega-3, which will improve, the fat composition in their body. And what we want to see or what we want to achieve from that is that if there will be a reversal of the effects of trauma. In a few months, we would be able to say conclusively, but I think we need more programs which focus on biology similar to this to actually give something very actionable to people. At this point, I could say, good environment, getting support, be vigilant about physical and psychological health. This is all what's needed to break the cycle of trauma. And just to add one more comment, I don't think any of these healers, who would awaken some kind of spirit in you or kundalini in you, et cetera, and no offense to them, but I don't think the evidence for whether these things are really reducing the effects of transgenerational trauma biologically, I don't think there's any evidence at this point.
And I am concerned as a psychotherapist about the psychological effects of those methods that were not researched. So we don't know if they help, but what is more important, we don't know if they are not causing some other effects that has not been researched. So if you are listening to this podcast, please make sure that you know where you are going and what you're doing, because you might get hurt. Last question. What is the relevance of the field for the society, especially in the context of the global conflicts? Why is it important to develop those research and talking about transgenerational trauma?
Yeah. So, transgenerational trauma in its broad concept, it can affect individuals, but it can also affect larger communities. There are whole societies and communities which undergo trauma, especially in the context of a war or genocide. And I think there are sometimes also repeated exposures, unfortunately, in the same population. If we just think about for example, the population in Ukraine, there was this whole genocide back in 1930s, the Holodomor. So it is potentially possible that they were all already carrying some biological effects of this genocide which they were exposed to, and then they have been repeatedly exposed to wars already now, in the conflict in Crimea in 2014 and for the last 2 years. Right now, a population which has been repeatedly exposed to this large community level trauma, it is very likely that there is an offsetting of some epigenetic pathways at the biological level. Unfortunately, there is not a lot of focus on mental health, to help these populations. Usually, aid agencies, they focus basically on, just giving them amenities to live for their survival. But I also think that we definitely need organized programs to study, number one, the biological impact of trauma in these populations, and number two, whatever we have learned from animal models or from these previous human studies, perhaps we can start applying to these populations which are really in need. Similarly, if we think about what is happening in Gaza right now, I just want to point out that there was this article actually from aid agencies, and they pointed out that they had to coin a new term for the children which are affected over there. and it's called Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. Now, these wounded children with no surviving family, they are not going to also face the physical impact of their injuries, but at the same time, the no surviving family is also going to wound their psychology. And these kind of wounds can definitely impact, their psychological health, potentially their germ cells, and this is very likely, unfortunately, to become transgenerational. So I think instead of finding transgenerational trauma within each other, which a lot of people do due to pop psychology, I think there are populations which really need our help. And there we can apply this kind of knowledge and science and psychological support to help them out. Maybe some of you might be aware of it, but I also want to mention that just like there is a physical first aid, there's also training for psychological first aid. And this is something, which a lot of us can learn to help out the people around us, especially the ones who have undergone something extremely traumatic. And I think this is like a responsibility perhaps all of us have to take.
I just want to remind to my listeners that when the war in Ukraine started, we were talking a lot about first aid, psychological first aid in moments like that. Because, for example, WHO already have manuals how to help out and what to do. Good luck with your research. I'm very inspired by this conversation, by this podcast, because at some point it's quite simple. That our biology is not something magical. It influences our interaction with environment and other people, and it works both ways. So I am waiting for your papers, and I hope that we will do some good with the outcome of the research. Thank you so much for being in this podcast.
Thank you very much.
Dziękuję Wam bardzo za obecność. No i cóż, mam nadzieję, że na spokojnie przetrawicie i przetworzycie to nasze dzisiejsze spotkanie. Raz jeszcze dziękuję patronom i patronkom za to, że takie spotkania i takie podcasty mogę tworzyć, a Wy bierzcie i korzystajcie z tego śmiało. Do usłyszenia już w kolejnym tygodniu i w kolejnym odcinku.